The Astronauts continued by Stanislaw, translated from the German by the Spirit of Hegel. The Corkscrew Rule. Barely an hour later, the rocket was over the lake. We descended. The mountains grew. The dark surface of the lake became ever larger, and suddenly the water, heated by the glowing atomic gases, hissed and bubbled. The Cosmo crater, which had left a white foam-like trail behind it, floated a few hundred meters further until it lay still, barely rocked by the waves. When the engines had stopped, Arseniev called me to the common cabin to report on the reconnaissance flight. I was convinced that my discovery was crucial for the further course of the research, and that we should go immediately to the dead forest to search for the metal ants. Unfortunately, I had lost a little prisoner due to my carelessness. During takeoff, he and the tin box had been blown off the wing. When I finished my report, there was a brief silence. Then Arseniev said, "You have disappointed me. Please don't judge me by the fact that this adventure ended happily. One can only hope that this is indeed the case, because we still don't know how great a dose of radiation your body has absorbed is. This escapade into the depths of the dead forest was more than recklessness. It was a crime. You have no right to excuse your arbitrary actions by citing your possible death. You wanted to satisfy your lust without considering the danger. You acted as if after a few hours of abandonment, your ruin had already become an inevitable fact. What you did was certainly a demonstration of courage, but courage not backed by reason and understanding is of little use. If each of us were to venture out on our own, our expedition would soon come to a disastrous end. Do you have anything to say to that?" "No. I say all this in the presence of my companions," Arseniev continued in a calm tone, "so that we do not make similar mistakes in the future. Risks are only permitted in the case of absolute necessity. Should this arise, you can be sure that I will demand the utmost from you and myself. So let's talk about it no more. I would like to hear your suggestions as to what we should begin with." Lao Tzu spoke up. "We are in the position of a man who has opened a book written in a language he cannot understand. I even assume that he has opened it in the middle and is holding it upside down to boot. As long as we don't know what is law determined and what is merely momentary, what is essential and what is inessential, there is a fear that we will be misled by chance discoveries and false hypotheses. Therefore, I suggest that we should not even bother examining the question of whether the formations Smith discovered are metallic insects and the actual main inhabitants of the planet. Rather, we should begin by investigating the immediate vicinity of the lake and mapping it, so that we have a base of operations for further investigations. I don't want to impose my suggestion on anyone, but I am of the opinion that we must first gather as many facts as possible. We can only think about evaluating them later. In a word, hypothesis non fingere," asked Chandrasekhar. "Yes, sir," said the Chinese. "Let our research begin with this Newtonian principle." 4 days passed in uninterrupted work. Every day, I ascended by helicopter to take photochrometric images and theodolite measurements. After landing, Soltic and I developed the aerial photographs, compiled them into a stereoscopic map, and transferred the ground layout to a cartographic grid. This resulted in a map of our surroundings within a radius of 60 kilometers. Meanwhile, another group, consisting of Rayner and Osvetich, conducted the geological sounding of the ground. For this purpose, 2 forests were placed in the shore cliffs and detonated. When I was hanging in the helicopter cabin above a peak that formed the base of the triangulation triangle, The valley below me spun like a cyclopean forge. The scientists induced artificial earthquakes, recorded the seismographic waves with the help of highly sensitive instruments, and drew their conclusions about the structure of the deeper rock layers. Arsenyev and Lao Tzu swam around the lake in a motorboat and used ultrasound probes to examine the structure of the bottom. All our work was made very difficult by the constant fog, from which only the highest rock faces protruded. The physicists believed they could disperse it with the help of radioactive emitters. Using a beam of radiation, the vapor was ionized and then fell as a fine, warm rain. But after 20 minutes, the fog was just as thick as before. On the second day, as they cruised the lake again, Arsenyev and Lao Tzu noticed that the probe was giving two readings at once in some places. This device sends sound waves into the depths, which are reflected from the bottom and return. The depth is calculated from the time difference between the transmitted pulse and the echo. Now, however, in some places the echo was distorted as if by a double reflection. Close examination showed that the long object in the shape of a thick tube was hanging across the lake bottom. Its diameter was estimated at 5 to 6 meters. The pipe stretched in a perfectly straight line to the northeast, reached the shore, disappeared there at a depth of 60 meters, broke through the rock massif below the narrow pass through which I had passed during my reconnaissance flight, and then continued under the plain. Following the pipe in the opposite direction, the scientists reached the other shore of the lake. This looked quite strange. Instead of the white-grey rock debris that otherwise lined the shore everywhere, here rose a warty, outward-curving wall resembling the side of a capsized ship. Under the tread of an iron-shod shoes, the ground emitted short, high-pitched sounds. A cursory analysis revealed that it was iron covered with scaly rust fragments. I was summoned in my helicopter. With the help of the radar and the induction device, I managed to determine the boundaries of this iron formation. It was no more than 4 meters thick and spread over an area of 6 square kilometers. The uneven, jagged edges leaned against the rock debris. I left the helicopter on the water and participated in the investigation of this iron crust. The probes indicated that it broke off in a sharp line in a few meters below the water surface. The depth readings from the depth sounder were distorted and indecipherable. Since our diving suits allowed us to move just as well on land as underwater, I tried to dive. The water was so very warm. I slid down the smooth curve of the shore to a depth of about 5 meters. That's how deep the iron layer reached. Further down lay fine, dark gravel. I tried to dig under the iron edge to see how thick it was. Although I discovered a half-meter hollow, I couldn't reach the end. Towards the middle of the lake, the bottom sloped away rapidly. When I could only see a dark green glow from the daylight, I bumped my hands against the hard bulge. The iron reappeared in club-shaped vertical needles that protruded from the invisible bottom. It looked as if molten metal had flowed into the water and solidified. I had barely returned to shore when Arsenyev called me aboard the rocket via radio. As I landed the helicopter on the back of the cosmocrater, Arsenyev and Lao Tzu appeared in special diving suits and asked me to take them to the dead forest. I asked if I didn't also need a combat armored personnel carrier, but Arsenyev told me they would go alone. So I had no choice but to start the engine. The flight was uneventful. Maintaining my direction was made easier by the rocket's radio signals, which immediately brought me back on track as soon as I deviated. After 3/4 of an hour, the expansive light brown plane appeared at the edge of the dead forest. I landed near the threshold where the plane ended. The two scientists packed up their equipment and the fulgurite charges and left. I remained alone. The work of the last few days had been carried out so carefully and methodically, as if we were not on an alien planet but in some corner of our Earth. The mysterious phenomena were passed over in silence by the scientists. No one approached the iron shore and the strange tube. No one mentioned my metal ants even once, and I must admit that this sometimes annoyed me. Everyone I tried to question answered me as if they had agreed with the others. We'll have to wait and see. Or nothing can be said about that yet. Where was the romance of scientific work then? No wonder I now began to construct my own hypotheses. For days I've used that, for example, The shore was formed by the impact of an iron meteor on the rock. That the pipe was one of the tunnels through which the metal creatures moved. Chandrasekhar, when I shared with him, threw all these assumptions out of the window in the space of 5 minutes. So you see where inaccurate inductive reasoning can lead, he said. Of course, my ideas are worthless, I cried. The work here is a complete mystery to me. We discovered the pipe. Shouldn't we be looking into it? But no, I spent all day collecting water samples from various depths. I don't understand anything anymore. My companions are becoming more mysterious to me than the inhabitants of Venus. Oh, so we're a mystery to you. The mathematician smiled, but suddenly became serious, took my hand, and said, "We're just being cautious. It's not a forest of secrets surrounding us that determines our work, but something more fundamental." And what is that? I asked. The Earth. Always remember that, and then you'll understand that we mustn't make any mistakes, commit any errors. With these words, Chandrasekhar had defeated me. I had to agree with him, but even he couldn't quench the inner fire that consumed me. I forced myself to be patient, hoping that great events were still ahead of us. I didn't have to wait long for them. Loaded with crystal fragments, Arsenyev and Lao Tzu returned to the helicopter. We didn't exchange a word during the flight. Only in the rocket's airlock chamber, when the space had filled with oxygen and the astronomer had removed his black helmet, did he say to me, "A meeting will take place in an hour. I ask you to attend." On the table, in the common cabin, lay photographic and drawn maps, film strips, mineral samples, and radioactive materials enclosed in lead cassettes. Only the metal insects were missing. Arsenyev and Lao Tzu had been unable to find any. "Dear friends," Arsenyev began, "in 2 Earth days we expect twilight, then night will fall, our first night on Venus. It is advisable that we remain on board the rocket during this time. On the other hand, we still have 50 hours of daylight ahead of us. The preliminary research work is almost complete. I just think we can dare to make another foray into the field. Our goal is to establish contact with the inhabitants of Venus. Of everything we have discovered so far, I consider the artificial structure, the so-called tube, to be the most important." "It is a metallic conductor, and as far as we can rely on our investigations, using seismographic and radio waves, represents a kind of cable for power transmission. However, it does not appear to be active. During our entire stay at the lake, not even the slightest amount of energy flowed through it. Nevertheless, it deserves attention. One end rests beneath the iron crust on the shore. Let us consider whether it might not be worthwhile to search for the other one." Early in the morning, the hatches opened, and the helicopter, resembling a grasshopper with its widely spread legs, rolled onto the back of the rocket. The 4 of us took our seats in the fully glazed cabin. The 3-bladed propeller began to whirl around its axis, transformed into a transparent disk, and the machine rose into the air, buzzing like a beetle. A fresh wind dispersed the fog over the lake. Visibility improved. I flew only a few meters above the black water and headed first for the iron shore. With every gust of wind, the fog turned reddish-brown. It was as if the layers of rust were smoking. A sensitive induction device was attached beneath the helicopter, which reacted immediately to any metal deposits or veins. It was connected to my headphones by a cable, so that I heard a piercing clanging and whistling above the iron shore. Like a rapacious bird of prey, I began to circle until I heard a characteristic, repetitive, fine sound, the electric echo produced by the metallic tube. We now followed this reliable trail, and flew always in a straight line, first over the lake, then over the gravel heaps. Not the slightest sign of the tube's presence on the ground surface betrayed it. I made sure that the intensity of the sound in the earpieces remained constant, thus steering the aircraft smoothly and safely. Near the narrow passage, the helicopter encountered a strong air current. Far from both sides, gigantic dark cliffs reaching up into the clouds advanced. Below the crest of the rocks, the clouds condensed into white balls, like spray on a breakwater. Then the narrow passage widened again, and the helicopter, lifted high by the wind, flew out onto the plain. In a constant battle with the air eddies, I lost the acoustic trail, and it took minutes to find again. As I circled, I saw the lake once again shining through the low-hanging clouds at the exit of the rocky gate. The waves foamed against the shore, then the rocky ridge blocked the view. We had already been flying over undulating hills for over an hour, since I had to constantly monitor the electrical echo. Soltke maintained radio contact with the rocket. From time to time he signaled to me that everything was okay. Arseniev took pictures with the telephoto lens, and Rayner monitored the instruments that indicated the voltage of the cosmic rays. Seemingly motionless, the shimmering propeller disc stood diagonally above us. Only its monotonous whistle occasionally faded and then intensified again. At first we flew in the direction of the dead forest, but later the propeller made a wide arc to the northwest. The ground rose slowly but steadily. The isolated, rugged, strangely shaped rocks merged into angular massifs. More and more often I lost the trail and had to circle to find it again. Below the cabin windows, stony slopes covered with rocky outcrops, steep crags and ravines passed by. The acoustic trail led along a precipitous mountain range to a vast plateau covered in puffy clouds. At times the milky haze enveloped the entire cabin. Then again only the propeller was submerged, its glassy disk becoming dull and cloudy. Suddenly the clouds cleared. As if struck into the rock by a giant's fist, a dark abyss, a crater, yawned beneath us. The helicopter descended to the black rim of the crater wall, melted into glass and torn by hundreds of cracks. A little further on, behind the overhanging basalt slabs, there was a yawning emptiness. There the trail disappeared. Delicate drifting veils of mist clung to the edges of the abyss, spreading long, fluttering nets against the walls. I turned to Soltic. He shook his head and pointed at the intercom. There had been no sound for quite some time. Between us and the Cosmo crater lay the dead forest. We were on our own. I pushed the control stick forward. The helicopter now hung over the abyss, and above us the clouds hovered so thickly that the propeller wind set them in a gentle, circular motion. The aircraft rocked like a cork in choppy water. The propeller no longer found the necessary resistance in the rarefied atmosphere. It spun ever faster. It spun, and suddenly we were hurtling into the depths. Behind the windows, the cross-sections of the geological strata danced as if torn apart. The stick slowly regained altitude again. Behind the cabin windows, the sharp rocky ridges shrouded in haze. We receded and sank into the depths. It was not without a feeling of vertigo that one could gaze down into this cauldron. This was not the familiar landscape of our mountains, whose faces were marked by millennia of exposure to water and wind. Here, amidst the clouds, the walls rose, smooth as slabs of black ice. One shuddered as one gazed past these terrible spots, like a mountain eagle. The plain circled wide, climbed ever higher until the entire crater, a dark cauldron, filled with fog, lay far below us. "I've lost the trail," I told Arseniev. "Is that a volcano? Perhaps the pipe ends right here." "It doesn't look like a volcano. We can't land here, can we?" "No." He pushed the map towards me, on which he had marked the route they had flown with a red line. "The pipe hits the precipice sideways, almost tangentially." "The pipe hit the precipice sideways, almost tangentially, so we have to look for it on the opposite side, where those small rocks rise above the clouds, like sugarloaf. There, right?" I nodded and steered the helicopter above the precipice towards the indicated spot. The rock cones gleamed so dazzlingly white above the clouds that one could mistake them for hard frozen snow. The closer we approached them, the further the crater wall seemed to expand. Ever new crevices, hidden corners and cracks appeared, while a still faint, very distant sound sounded in the earpieces, something like a broken gate opened between two rocks whose narrow projections hung over the precipice. Behind it lay a long, steeply sloping ravine. The sound in the earpieces had changed. The membranes were now humming in the deepest bass. I communicated with the astronomer by looking at him. He nodded, which meant I should maintain my direction. I tried to go a little higher, but we immediately entered a cloud so dense that the outlines of the rocks were blurred on the radar. So I reversed the steering and ran. We sank between the walls of the ravine, so that we were now flying a few meters below its edges. The noises of the engine rose to a roar in the narrow space. The right side of the rock hung high in the air like an immense canopy. A cold, motionless shadow fell upon us. Once I left this dangerous spot behind me, the humming in the earpieces was replaced by a new sound, like a distant dull roar. About 100 meters ahead of us, the ravine made a sharp turn. Steep slopes thrusting into view blocked the view. "Can you land down there?" asked Arseniev. He had been eagerly following the needle on the induction device. "It seems worth it." "I'll try," I replied. Carefully, I let the machine slide down. Shrouded in murky shadows, the floor of the ravine emerged and rolled past us like a slowly moving film. It was covered with slanting, sharp-edged slabs of rock that almost sank beneath the layer of black rubble. Very close to the large bend, I noticed a fairly flat bare belt of rock, free of any rock fragments. It looked as if someone had deliberately thrown the black lava blocks aside. However, at that moment I didn't give this strange phenomenon much thought. I was glad I had found a place to land. I turned off the engine and used the propeller as a parachute. With a shrill whistle, it cut through the air. The helicopter landed just short of a hill of black rubble. The roar of my earpieces became so unbearable that I pushed them aside. Arseniev put on his helmet and was the first to jump out of the cabin. Soltik, Rayner, and I followed him. Lodestone, Rayner stated, barely having picked up one of the boulders. "Iron ore, and very high in iron ore." "Aha, that's why the device was humming like that," I exclaimed. Arseniev bent down, crawled under the helicopter's square eagle undercarriage, unbuckled the induction device, and plugged the cable ends into the socket of his diving suit. Then he took the device and walked along the ravine in the direction we had come from, striding briskly and leaping nimbly from stone to stone. I followed. Wildly jagging rock faces rose on both sides. Clouds had settled on their edges, filling the ravine with a strange pale twilight glow. The humming was caused by the ore. "We're definitely on the wrong track," I said to Arseniev when I caught up with him. "I suspect there's something else here besides that damn magnetite," he replied, suddenly changing direction. He climbed up a large fold in the rock that blocked the way and dropped vertically on the other side. "There's no crossing here," I warned, but Arseniev continued climbing. After a few steps I saw a small flat area in the shadow of a rocky outcrop that obscured half the sky. I had barely set foot on it when I noticed that it was warmer there. Shortly afterwards I stood in front of a black chasm that looked like the entrance to a giant tunnel. Its circular cross-section could only be guessed at among the piled-up boulders. Arseniev pulled the flashlight out of his pocket and switched it on. Something gleamed in the cracks between the rubble. I pushed against the stone lying beside it. As it gave way, I rolled the next ones aside and finally grabbed a torn and dented piece of corrugated sheet metal. Arseniev took the reflector in his left hand, grasped the induction device with his right, and approached the rubble wall. "They had to come here with special equipment to clear the stones," Soltik remarked. "Perhaps this is their path," I asked. "This isn't the path," replied the astronomer. He stepped over the rolling stones and shone his light into the cracks. "This is the pipe." "The pipe?" "Yes. Torn. Destroyed by some catastrophe. Perhaps by an earthquake." "Destroyed," I repeated, shocked. I stood amidst the chaotically piled up rocks, in which the outlines of the tunnel were lost. Only when I took a few steps back did I see these outlines again. They appeared as an uneven, broken, oval line between angular fragments. Arseniev approached us. "The pipe, whose trail we were flying along, is breaking up somewhere in the crater wall. There," he pointed back. "It's completely dead. Not the slightest amount of current flows through it. What we heard during our own flight, the acoustic trace, was nothing other than the electric echo of our devices, reflected back from its metal casing. This part here," he pointed to the stone barricade, "is active. Do you want to hear it?" He handed me the cable and at the same time pointed the device toward the tunnel entrance. That is... Arseniev interrupted me quickly. Please don't finish. Then he gave Soltic the cable, so he too could hear the sounds emanating from the depths. Well, what does it remind you of? Electrical tubes, we cried in unison. For a while we looked at each other in silence. Light from the reflector cast our shadows onto the rocky vault, like the silhouettes of hunched giants with triangular heads. The light played on our helmets. Yes, confirmed the astronomer. It's the same resonance that cathode tubes emit when they're electrified. Why would there be cathode tubes here? And where exactly? In the tube? Arseniev shrugged. I knelt down and lifted some of the flat stones that lay beneath our feet. The layer beneath was covered with dark mud. When I touched it, my fingers were caught in a disgusting mess. I quickly tried to withdraw my hand, but encountered a round, hard object. Soon after, I pulled something out from under the stones that at first glance looked like a broken branch, but strictly speaking, had little in common with a branch. It was a short, rather thick cylinder that divided into three thin inner parts, which in turn divided several times, terminating in bundles of thin, stiff rods. The whole thing weighed about 15 kilograms and was about 1 meter long. The thickest cylinder had a series of concentric rings at its base, alternating between grey and yellow metal. It looks like an aluminium willow, I said. Isn't that right, Professor? Arseniev examined the find very carefully, taking each branch individually between his fingers and approaching it without any results to the measuring device. Then he looked round. We'll fly over the ravine and follow the trail of the pipe. That magnetite will be a real nuisance, I objected. It won't do any harm. The pipe will repair itself from now on. We returned to the helicopter. Arseniev stopped there, thought for a moment, and climbed onto one of the boulders. Wait, I have to investigate something else. He switched on the device and walked around the landing site. The pipe is close to the surface here. This open space, something's wrong. If only we knew what. I don't understand, he muttered to himself. Professor Rayner suddenly asked him, what do you think? Could that chasm we flew over actually be an extinct volcano? Judging by the rocks on Earth, I would answer out of the question. Even a tectonic earthquake paints a completely different picture. Here, however, I can only say I don't know. But why does this pipe appear? Could it be a coincidence? I think I understand what you're getting at, said Soltic. In your opinion, the pipe must lie deeper, right? If as an engineer I were to build such a massive power line, I would lay it at least 6 meters deep. That's not what I meant, replied Arseniev. But this fact is truly striking and worth considering. It is truly striking, he repeated. One involuntarily assumes that the terrain only changed after the pipeline had already been laid. Do you know something? Let's go beyond this large bend. Perhaps we can see more from there. We descended a few hundred steps over blackish rock. I was faster than the others and was the first to reach the rocky gully into which the gorge narrowed. A little further down, at a distance of perhaps 200 meters, I saw an opening, darkly framed by the last rocks of the gorge. Beyond it, in bright daylight, lay a wide valley, a basin, in the center of which spread a large lake. Not a single wave ruffled its murky grey surface, shrouded in the thin veils of mist. From all sides, scree slopes converged on the shore, encircling the lake like an enormous steep funnel. Between cliffs and gullies, groups of irregularly shaped rock needles rose. On the right, a small white circle stood out brightly against the dark background of the jagged rocks. Someone approached me so close that he touched my shoulder, but I didn't pay any attention. Almost at the same time as my companion, it was Arseniev. I put the binoculars to my eyes. I squinted a few times, thinking I was mistaken. But no, the lens was perfectly sharp. Over there, a white sphere was indeed blinking. It stood out incredibly sharply against the tangle of rock debris. Could you land down there? Asked the astronomer. I didn't answer immediately, but first examined the terrain with my binoculars. Everywhere boulders with sharp brittle edges piled up on top of each other. Everywhere endless slopes of scree with their great tongues pushed down to the shore. In some places the boulders hung so precariously over one another that they seemed to lose their balance and tumble down as soon as one looked away from them. A landing would be dangerous, I finally explained. If these boulders started to slide, the plane would roll over, and in the process, the propeller could at least bend. It's probably better if we go down. It's no more than 3 kilometers. I don't know if we shouldn't return to the rocket, Arsenyev said thoughtfully. It's a pity we don't have our flotation device with us. Then we could land on the lake. He thought of the inflatable rubber balls the helicopter could use to land on the water. We had left them in the rocket so as not to overload the machine. Professor, shall we return now? I cried. Now that we're so close to solving the riddle? It seems to me we're not at all that close to solving the riddle. Our companion stood next to us on a rocky ledge and looked through their glasses at the rubble desert. Arsenyev pointed in the induction device toward the ground and listened to the immediate surroundings. It looks as if the tube is moving rapidly toward the sphere, he said, but the reception is poor. This damned magnetite. High piles of iron ore rolled out of the gorge, covered the slopes, narrowed further down into a wedge, and merged into a glare as bright as that of the entire valley. Arsenyev threw the device back over his back and attached it to the broad shoulder strap. Very well, let's move on. You drive, pilot. The deeper we descended over the glare, the more inhospitable the area became. The boulders rolled away beneath my feet, dragging others with them. When I turned around, I no longer saw the helicopter. The dark ravine already hid it. The steeper the slope became, the more difficult the climbing became. With every crossing, the stones slid down. Suddenly, an entire layer slid beneath me with increasing speed. I was just able to jump sideways onto a stone slab in time. This tiring march dragged on and on. We had already crossed the lower limit of the magnetite. The surface of the gravel field shimmered before our eyes and seemed to sway, a phenomenon caused by countless sparkling small quartz crystals. Stay still for a moment, Arsenyev asked. This time he pointed the device vertically at the ground. The pipe isn't far from us, but he didn't finish the sentence, but stepped closer to me and handed me the cable. I plunged it in and flinched. The steady drone was so loud. Arsenyev looked up the slope we had descended, as if estimating the distance separating us from the ravine. Then he moved on. Gradually, we approached the white sphere. Its size was difficult to estimate. On the left, 4 rock needles arose behind it. On the right, a group of pointed obelisks stood closely huddled together, surrounded by weathered fragments. Between us and the sphere lay a narrow bay, dark and silent, enclosed by rocky slopes. The other shore was covered with shattered boulders and threateningly gleaming, vertically erected slabs of rock. Suddenly the astronomer stopped. The white sphere is transmitting, he said dully. The induction device was now superfluous. The deep hum of the radio receiver inside the helmet was growing steadily louder. I hurried after Arsenyev. He jumped over the rocky debris, was the first to reach the bay, and jumped into the water without hesitation. He sank under, but immediately resurfaced. The water reached up to his armpits. We quickly helped each other climb the sloping rock slab of the far bank. From there we saw the white sphere again. It cast light shadows on the field of gravel. A slope led to the shattered rock needles. Behind the last one lay a flat area, covered with fragments of rock and fine gravel. From there one could no longer see the entire sphere. It stood before us like a curved, smooth wall. We approached. I touched the white wall with my fingertips. My heart beat loudly and rapidly. I raised my head. The sphere loomed gigantic and motionless above me. I leaned my shoulders against its wall. The helicopter was nowhere to be seen. In the distance, beyond the slope and its field of gravel which we had crossed, the opening of the ravine yawned between the separating rocks. The drone is getting louder and louder, said Rayner. Wouldn't it be more advisable to leave this place? Arsenyev looked at the radiation meter. There was no radiation at all, but I believe that He broke off mid-sentence. Lightning flashed in the dark gate of the ravine. Thunder rolled for a long time. Once again there was lightning and thunder. Then thick clouds of smoke billowed from the chasm and rolled languidly down over the boulders. No one of us spoke a word. We stood as if petrified, staring at the smoking mouth of the ravine. Finally the astronomer slung his instrument over his shoulders and looked at each of us in silence. "I think we'll spend the night outside the rocket tonight," he said, striding toward the bay. It took us almost 2 hours to get back. With pounding hearts, breathless sweat streaming down our throats, almost running, we entered the ravine, which welcomed us with muted silence. It was considerably colder here than down in the valley. One after the other, we climbed the boulders, scrambled over wobbly slabs, and jumped from rock to rock until the landing site lay before us. The rock was covered in scum, charred shreds, structural parts still clinging to glowing drops of molten metal. Something silver gleamed in front of my shoe. It was part of the undercarriage with a retaining screw, shredded like a slick stick of paper. Arsenyev barely glanced at the scene of devastation. He placed the induction apparatus on the ground and listened for a long time. "This is what we get for our stupidity," he finally said, picked up the apparatus, turned round, and walked back. Wordlessly, we climbed down the precipitous slope to the valley below. Only our footsteps and the sound of the stones rolling down broke the silence. Near the exit of the ravine, Arsenyev approached the large stone slab resting on the edges of the several boulders, forming a natural tail. 15 minutes of rest and consultation, he announced. "Are you clear about what's going on?" As he said this, he spread out the map he had pulled down from the outer pocket of his driver on the table. As for me, I didn't understand any of it. My head was in complete confusion. All I could imagine was this: a catastrophe had occurred, the consequences of which were incalculable. We had lost the helicopter, the instruments, and the food. All we had left was 1 can of food per person as a last resort, a small amount of water, and the oxygen supply we still had scuba tanks. Soltic also carried a hand-held ray gun, and I carried a coil of rope. That was all. "You don't assume, do you, that was an attack?" Soltic said hesitantly. "No, I think we ourselves are largely to blame. But why?" I cried. Arsenyev didn't answer. "The fuel exploded in the tanks," Rayner thought aloud. "But that was only the beginning. Can one connect the catastrophe with the roaring that could be heard beneath the ball?" Yes, the tube." "So, electromagnetic fields," asked Soltic, "and of enormous strength. Millions of gases must have been at work in a fraction of a second." My mind was beginning to dawn, but I couldn't piece together the fragments I'd heard. "These stones, the magnetite. Professor, does that have anything to do with the open space where we landed?" "That's just it," cried Arsenyev. Despite the tragedy of our situation, these words echoed the triumph of the scholar who had succeeded in finding a solution to the problem. The open space. He held the map, which fluttered in the wind, with one hand and pointed with the other to the path we had taken to the site of the catastrophe. I put aside. "The matter is so simple that a child could understand it, and we acted like idiots. The pipe, which usually lies at a depth of several dozen meters everywhere, runs here almost at the surface of the rocks. One side is the open space. On the other, there are large piles of rock debris. It's not bound rock, it's magnetite, iron ore. The moment current flows through it, its electromagnetic field is created around the pipe. As long as the voltage in the conductor remains unchanged, it remains immobile. As the voltage increases, the field begins to swirl in accordance with Ørsted law." "Damn it," I exclaimed. The corkscrew law." "Yes. It states that the field rotates around the conductor in the manner of a corkscrew when the current flows in the opposite direction. In the Barger experiments, copper wire is used as the conductor, and iron filings are used as the objects intended to set the field in motion. Here it was an underground cable and lumps of magnetite. When the current had reached a sufficiently high voltage, the electromagnetic field throws these lumps from one side of the pipe to the other. In this way, the debris was formed near the pipe and the open space west of it. But the pipe is broken above that point, I objected. That doesn't matter. It's simply grounded and the current enters the rock. Consider that the ground there is made of iron ore, which offers almost no resistance to the current. Of course. So the helicopter was also thrown against the debris wall. Yes, and then the fuel exploded. I turned off the ignition. As a result of the induction, eddy currents from such tremendous power must have been created within the metal structure that the metal melted in an instant, explained the engineer. I hung my head. That was a good landing, I said dejectedly. I landed well. The flat open space was a trap. But who could have known that? Every one of us, Arseny retorted sharply. We had all the evidence in our hands. We knew that that part of the pipe was alive, although when we were there it was the weak current, which could, however, intensify at any moment. We also realized that the open space was bordered by a wall of iron ore debris. Why? Who had thrown it there? And or what? For our convenience? We should have thought. Right, said Soltic. But enough of that now. Let's leave the matter alone. Let's consider what to do. 4 helmeted men bent over the map. As the crow flies, we are separated from the rocket by about 90 to 100 kilometers of difficult terrain. Very difficult terrain, you could say. We have little water, food, and oxygen. Arsenyev looked at the pressure gauge on the oxygen apparatus. It's enough for about 40 hours, I said. Perhaps not even 40 hours, if we're forced to undertake greater physical exertion. You know what we discussed with our companions in the rocket? If we haven't returned by 8 o'clock in the evening, Osvetich will fly the plane along the acoustic trail. If he doesn't lose it before then, he'll reach the crater where the trail ends. The astronomer looked at me. Can you fly the plane into the ravine? I closed my eyes. The black, jagged rock walls appeared before me again. Flying into the ravine is possible, I replied, but you can't turn around. An airplane can't hang motionless in the air like a helicopter. So that means any attempt would end in disaster. Any attempt. Let's hope Osvetich is sensible, the astronomer said dryly. Good. In the best case scenario, you'll be able to drop containers of food over the edge of the gap. What the astronomer was talking about was part of the rescue plan we had worked out before our departure. If Osvetich couldn't find us, he would drop parachute-attached containers containing food and oxygen, equipped with special radios that would transmit automatic signals to make it easier for us to find them. We could cross the gorge in a few hours, Arseniev continued, but the walls of the crater are impassable. Whatever route we choose, it is impossible for the rocket to reach before nightfall. That is, in 26 to 28 hours. Do you remember the gorges and crevices we flew over? I only sketched them on the map because I was counting on the photographs that are now lost to us. So what do you suggest? There was profound silence. Only the wind whistled around the corners and edges of the rocky debris. The map Arsenyev, holding onto its edge, fluttered restlessly. If we could travel for 4 to 5 kilometers per hour and didn't stop at all, we could theoretically we are in a position to reach the Cosmic Crater in 1 day. Soltic finally said. Of course, such a calculation had no practical value. We don't know how long ravines and similar obstacles would delay us, and above all, whether they can be crossed or bypassed. Therefore, I suggest marching not southwest in the direction of the rocket, but east at right angles to the path we have been flying. I looked at the engineer in astonishment. He continued calmly. The range of our radio is long, but only in a straight line. We can therefore only establish contact with our companions if we are at such a considerable altitude that there are no terrain obstacles between us and the rocket. It would therefore by no means be sufficient to approach the plateau from the side from which we came, or to climb, because then the dense forest with its ionized zone, which reflects the waves like a mirror, lies between us and the rocket. But if we go like this, he pointed to the area behind the eastern edge of the valley, and climb one of these peaks, then perhaps we will succeed in making the connection. Perhaps, Verena said slowly. I don't see any other way out. Of course, we won't have absolute certainty, Zoltik said. No, it's difficult to estimate the distance precisely. We're about 5 to 6 kilometers from this rock massive. No more. If we add 8, 9, or even 10 hours for the climb, then we'll be at a point that dominates the entire area. The lake on which the rocket lies is surrounded by high cliffs, I remarked. Have you considered that? Yes. The narrow passage to the lake runs northeast, that is, in the direction of our mountain range. I agree, I declared. But if we manage to establish contact, the rocket will get us, and we won't have to spend the night outdoors. The idea is good, said Arsenyev, even if it's not easy to implement. So shall we accept the proposal? We nodded in agreement. Now that we no longer have the technical tools Earth provided us with, only time will tell us what we're worth. Arsenyev stood up and turned to me. You're the most experienced mountaineer among us. We're counting on you. Shall we leave right away? I asked. I was thinking of testing the water in the lake first. Perhaps it's drinkable. Good. Then I'll look around for the most suitable route. Would you mind lending me your binoculars? I asked. Arsenyev, for his lenses were stronger than mine. My companions descended to the lake, and I turned toward the group of slender rock towers, 2 of which I had already chosen during the meeting. They stood so close together that they looked like a giant obelisk split lengthwise. I forced myself into the gap and pushed myself up, alternating between my legs and back, bracing myself with my hands. For a while I still heard fragments of the conversation between Arsenyev and Soltik. After they disappeared around the bend, I no longer heard their voices either. The rock needle wasn't very sharp. If you'd angled your legs into the abyss, you could sit comfortably up there. I looked through the binoculars. Above the cleft, which was clearly visible in the circular field of view, rose 2 peaks. They were shrouded in a thin, leaden-grey mist that obscured the fine contours, the details of the rock formation. But I spotted a rocky ridge rising from the scree slopes and leading up to the main massif. Suddenly it seemed to me as if a white cloud which was just passing over one of the 2 peaks had suddenly disappeared. That could only mean that there was a valley between us and this peak. I observed the area very attentively and thoroughly, but couldn't find anything that would have dispelled my doubts. The others, however, weren't supposed to know anything about it. Soon afterwards their voices came through the headphones again. Well, how's the water? I asked, putting the binoculars back in their cases. Then I looped a double rope around the rocky outcrop. It's more like formalin solution than water, answered Arsenyev. It was a strange contrast. The companions approaching the base of the spire looked like large-headed grey ants from this height, and yet I heard them talking loudly and clearly. I pushed off vigorously with my feet and slid quickly down the rope. A few seconds later, I was back with my companions. I pulled on the end of the rope, which fell down in loose coils. I hope you've chosen a less airy route for us, Raina said, watching somewhat suspiciously as I wrapped the rope over my shoulder. I suspected, not without reason, that he was afraid of such a climb, or he was the least familiar with the mountains of all of us. The path is excellent, I reassured him, and developed my plan. First along the edge of the magnetic strip, across the gravel field to the wall, then a small traverse to the left, and from there we continue climbing over the ridge. I think there's a crevice at one point. Either we cross it or we go around it. Well, either or, Rainer wanted to know, is it perhaps closer if we cross it? In any case, we'll get to the summit faster that way. It's the shortest route. We set off, and the boulders in front of us were so splintered, torn, and steep that we often had to climb over them on all fours. But behind them lay long, rough, bumpy slabs, on which we made reasonable progress. There's one thing I don't understand, I said to Arseniev, who was walking beside me. Why did the voltage in the pipe increase precisely from the moment we landed? Was that really just a coincidence? Why not? The pipe is probably part of a large energetic network in which enormous currents flow at certain intervals. This process begins with a slow increase in voltage. Think of the sound of the echo, which reminded us of live pipes. Then increasingly strong waves follow. You heard the roaring beneath the sphere, until finally the peak of the force is reached. The phenomenon can repeat itself within a few hours or even once a day. So the rock fragments where we landed had already been thrown to one side by the current, hadn't they? Of course. We fell silent, for the slope became ever steeper. The bare rock crunched beneath our steps. We approached the crest of the mountain ridge that surrounded the valley. I turned around and looked once more into the depths. The rocky background lay dead and ephemeral, merging with the dark waters of the lake. The clouds drifted languidly overhead. The white sphere had become a small dot, barely visible among the grey rock. I jumped. Someone had placed a hand on my shoulder. It was Arseniev. Like me, he too was looking back at the scene of our defeat. We were silent. The blood pounded in his temples. The muffled roar of the wind emerged from the edges and jagged edges of the cliff. This isn't the last time we've been here, said Arseniev. He stood still for a moment and moved on. His diving suit blended in at times with the grey-brown of the rocks. Only his metal helmet still sparkled among the large debris. High above us, shrouded in clouds, rose the peak that was our next destination.